I think we are live. Oop, gotta feed my kitty. We're gonna try doing some reading today. Oh god, where is it? Alright, we got Audacity open to record the audio. Let me just get out my fletching stuff real quick, because that's what I'll be doing in the background. Where's the knife? So unorganized in here. Alright. 3, 2, 1. Charles XI, or Karl, was King of Sweden from 1660 until his death in a period of Swedish history known as the Swedish Empire, 1611 to 1621. He was the only son of King Charles X Gustav of Sweden and Hedwig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp. His father died when he was 4 years old, so Charles was educated by his governors until his coronation at the age of 17. Soon afterward, he was forced out on military expeditions to secure the recently acquired dominions from Danish troops in the Scanian War. Having successfully fought off the Danes, he returned to Stockholm and engaged in correcting the country's neglected political, financial, and economic situation. He managed to sustain peace during the remaining 20 years of his reign. Changes in finance, commerce, national maritime, and land amendments, judicial procedure, church governance, and education emerged during this period. Charles XI was succeeded by his only son, Charles XII, who made use of the well-trained army in battles throughout Europe. Charles was born in the Stockholm palace Tre Kronor in November 1655. His father, Charles X of Sweden, had left Sweden in July that year to fight in the war against Poland. After several years of warfare, the king returned in the winter of 1659, gathered his family in the Riksdag of the Estates in Gothenburg. Here, he beheld his 4-year-old son for the first time. Only a few weeks later, in mid-January 1660, the king fell ill. 1 month later, he wrote his last will and died. Charles X Gustav's will and testament left the administration of the Swedish Empire during Charles XI's minority to a regency led by Queen Dowager Hedwig Eleonora as both formal regent and chair of a 6-member regency council with 2 votes and a final say over the rest of the council. Per Brahe was 1 member of the council. In addition, Charles X Gustav left command of the army and a seat on the council to his younger brother Adolf John I, Count Palatine of Kleeberg. These provisions, among others, led to the remainder of the council immediately challenging the will. On February 14th, the day after King Charles X's death, Hedwig Eleonora sent a message to the council stating that she knew they contested the will and that she demanded that it should be respected. The council answered that the will must first be discussed with the parliament, and at the following council in Stockholm on May 13th, the council tried to keep her from attending. The parliament questioned whether it would be good for her health or suitable for a widow to attend council, and that, if not, it would be hard to keep sending a messenger to her quarters. Her reply was that the council would be allowed to meet without her and only inform her where they considered necessary was met with satisfaction from the council. Hedwig Eleanor's ostensible indifference to politics came as a great relief to the lords of the Guardian government. His mother, Queen Hedwig Eleonora, remained the formal regent until Charles XI attained his majority on December 18, 1672, but she was careful not to embroil herself in political conflicts. During his first appearances in Parliament, Charles spoke to the government through her. He would whisper the questions he had in her ear, and she would ask them aloud and clearly for him. As an adolescent, Charles devoted himself to sports, exercise, and his favorite pastime of bear hunting. He appeared ignorant of the bare rudiments of statecraft and almost illiterate. His main difficulties are now seen as evident signs of dyslexia, a disability that was poorly understood at the time. According to many contemporary sources, the king was considered poorly educated and therefore not qualified to conduct himself effectively in foreign affairs. Charles was dependent on his mother and advisors to interact with foreign envoys since he had no foreign language skills apart from German and was ignorant of the world outside of Sweden. Italian writer Lorenzo Magalotti visited Stockholm in 1674 and described the teenage Charles XI as virtually afraid of everything, uneasy to talk to foreigners, and not daring to look anyone in the face. Another trait was a deep religious devotion. He was God-fearing, frequently prayed kneeling, and attended sermons. Magalotti otherwise described the king's main pursuits as hunting, the upcoming war, and jokes. The situation in Europe was shaky during his time, and Sweden was going through financial problems. Charles XI's guardians decided to negotiate an alliance with France in 1671. This would ensure that Sweden would not be isolated if there was war, and that national finances would improve thanks to French subsidies. France directed its aggression against the Dutch in 1672, and by the spring of 1674, Sweden was forced to take part by directing forces towards Brandenburg under the lead of Carl Gustav Wrangel. Denmark was an ally of the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire, and it was evident that Sweden was on the verge of yet another war with that country. A remedy was attempted by Chancellor Niels Brahe, who traveled to Copenhagen in spring of 1675 to try to get the Danish princes Ulrika Eleonora of Denmark engaged with the Swedish king. In mid-June 1675, the engagement was officially proclaimed. However, when news arrived of the Swedish defeat at the Battle of Fehrbellin, Danish King Christian IV declared war on Sweden that September. The Swedish Privy Council continued its internal feuds, and the king was forced to rule without them. The 20-year-old king was inexperienced and considered ill-served amidst what had been called the anarchy in the nation. He dedicated autumn in his newly formed camp in Scania to arm the Swedish nation for battle in the Scanian War. The Swedish soldiers in Scania were outnumbered and out-equipped by the Danes. In May 1676, they invaded Scania, taking Landskrona and Helsingborg, then proceeding through Bohuslän towards Halmstad. The king had to grow up quickly. He suddenly found himself alone and under great pressure. Victory at the Battle of Halmstad, August 16, 1676, when Charles' commander-in-chief, Simon Grundle Helmfelt, defeated a Danish division, was the king's first glimmer of good luck. Charles continued south through Scania, arriving on the tableland of the flooded Kalving River near Lund, on November 11th. The Danish army commanded by Christian V was positioned on the other side. It was impossible to cross the river, and Charles had to wait for weeks until it froze over. This finally happened on December 4th, and Charles launched a surprise attack on the Danish forces to fight the Battle of Lund. This was one of the bloodiest engagements of its time. Of the over 20,000 combatants, about 8,000 perished on the battlefield. All the Swedish commanders showed ability, but the chief glory of the day was attributed to Charles XI and his fighting spirit. The battle proved to be a decisive one for the rule of the Sanian lands, and it has been described as the most significant event for Charles' personality. Charles commemorated the date the rest of his life. In the following year, 13,000 men led by Charles routed 12,000 Danes at the Battle of Landskrona. This proved to be the last pitched battle of the war, since in September 1678, Christian V evacuated his army back to Zealand. In 1679, Louis XIV of France dictated the terms of a general pacification, and Charles XI, who is said to have bitterly resented the insufferable tutelage of the French king, was forced at last to acquiesce to a peace that managed to leave his empire partially intact. Peace was made of Denmark in the treaties of Fontainebleau, 1679, and Lund, and with Brandenburg in the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, 1679. Charles devoted the rest of his life to avoiding further warfare by gaining larger independence in foreign affairs. While he also promoted economic stabilization and the reorganization of the military, his remaining 20 years on the throne were the longest peacetime of the Swedish Empire, from 1611 to 1718. In the early years, he was assisted by the man who had become his trusted prime minister, Johan Goransson Gesneria, 1635 to 1680. Some sources say the king was basically dependent on Gyllenstierna. His sudden death in 1680 opened up the road to the monarch, and many men tried to get close to the king and take Gyllenstierna's place. That's a rough pronunciation. Sweden's weak economy had suffered during the war and was now in a deep crisis. Charles assembled the Riksdag of the Estates on October 1680. The assembly has been described as one of the most important held by the Riksdag of the Estates. Here, the king finally pushed through the reduction ordeal, something that had been discussed in the Riksdag since 1650. It meant that any land or object previously owned by the crown and lent or given away, including counties, baronies, and lordships, could be recovered. It affected many prominent members of the nobility, some of who were ruined by it. One of them was a former guardian and Lord Chief, who, among many other estates, had to return to the extravagant 248-room Laco Castle. The reduction process involved the examination of every title deed in the kingdom, including the dominions, and it resulted in a complete readjustment of the nation's finances. According to Swedish legend, Charles XI traveled around the country dressed as a farmer or simple traveler. In the legend, he is referred to as the Greycoat. This was done to discover and identify corruption and oppression against the populace. There are many stories about him arriving in villages, looking for corrupt church officials, and punishing them. One anecdote tells of him visiting one village with a church in splendid condition and the priests living in poverty. Continuing, the king found the next village a church in disrepair, and of priests living lavishly. The king solved the situation by switching the priests, giving the poor priests lavish living condition, and the church the king was certain he would Always followed by a military cortege, Charles toured the country more than other Swedish kings during this era and was famous for the speed at which he traveled, setting many records. The stories of the Greycoat were published in a book by Arvid August Afzelius in the middle of the 19th century. Another important decision made during the assembly was that of the Swedish Privy Council. Since 1634, it had been mandatory for the king to take advice from the council. During the Sanian War, the members of the council were engaged in internal feuds, and the king more or less ruled without listening to their advice. At the 1680 assembly, he asked the estates whether he was still bound to the council, to which the estates responded with his desired reply: he was not bound by anyone other than himself, and thereby the absolute monarchy was formally established in Sweden. The Riksdag of the Estates confirmed his power in 1693 by officially proclaiming that the king was the sole ruler of Sweden. In the 1682 assembly of the Riksdag of the Estates, the king put forth his suggestion for military reform, whereby each of the lands of Sweden were to have 1,200 soldiers at the ready at all times, and 2 farms were to provide accommodations for 1 soldier. His soldiers were known as Karelians, trained to be skilled and preferring to attack rather than defend. Savagery and looting were strictly forbidden. Soldier huts around the country were the most visible part of the new Swedish allotment system. However, Charles also modernized. Charles XI was initially enthusiastic about warfare and combat, and he was often portrayed as the soldier king. In the years before the Sanian War, however, during which he personally engaged in fighting and saw the devastation of war, he later come to view that war was something better to be avoided if possible. With the recent war in mind, he wanted to strengthen the armed forces for a defensive war, which he knew would come sooner or later. The Swedish Navy suffered major defeats against Danish-Dutch forces in the Sanian War, revealing deficiencies in organization and supply, and disadvantages in basing the fleet at Stockholm. The Navy was bolstered with the founding of an ice-free base at Karlskrona in 1680, which became the mainstay of future naval operations. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Excuse me. Charles believed it was very important to assimilate the new Swedish territories of Sania, Belking, Halland in southern Sweden, Bohuslän in western Sweden, and Jämtland in northern Sweden, and the island of Gotland. Some assimilation policies included the ban of all books written in Danish or Norwegian, thus breaking the promise made at the Treaty of Roskilde, the use of Swedish language in the conduct of sermons, and all new priests and teachers having to come from Sweden. The king had seen bitter resentment from Sanian peasants during the Sanian War and was particularly tough on that province. The guerrilla Snafanate movement in northern Sania had attacked his soldiers and stolen his money. They also had a strong support from the local villages. Charles remained suspicious of the Sanian inhabitants throughout his life. He did not allow soldiers from Sania's Sanian regiment. The 1,200 soldiers that were to be stationed there had to be recruited from more northern provinces. He also advocated rough treatment on the inhabitants, and the first Governor-General of Sania, his trusted aide, Johann Gillencierna, Governor-General from 1679 to 1680, was notably brutal in his treatment of the locals. The rule of Rutger von Aschenberg, Governor-General 1680 to 1693, proved more lenient. The assimilation was not as strongly implemented in the German dominions of Swedish Pomerania, Bremen-Verden, and the Baltic dominions, Estonia and Livonia. In Germany, Charles found himself being opposed by the estates there. He was also bound by the law of the German Emperor and the peace treaty. In the Baltic, the power structure was completely different, with a German-descended nobility that used serfs, something that Charles abhorred and wanted to abolish but was unable to. Finally, Kexholm and Ingria were sparsely populated and not of great interest. Charles was a devoted Lutheran Christian. In February 1686, a church law was put forth on his initiative. The church order declared the king was ruler of the church in the same way that he ruled the country and God ruled the world. Attending sermon risked arrest. 3 years later, he declared it obligatory for all commoners to learn to read a catechism written by Archbishop Olavs Fezbilis and then Bishop Hackfin Spiegel, so they could understand the magnificence of God. Charles encouraged the production of a hymnal, or psalm book, to be printed and distributed to the churches, completed in 1693, and a new printed version of the Bible that was completed in 1703, named after his successor, Charles XII Bible. Excuse me. On May 6, 1680, Charles married Ulrika Eleonora of Denmark, 1656 to 1693, daughter of King Frederick III of Denmark, 1609 to 1670. He had previously been engaged to his cousin, Juliana of Hesse-Eschwege, but the engagement was broken after a scandal. Charles and Ulrika were engaged in 1675 in an attempt to smooth over long-standing hostilities, but the Sanian War soon broke out. During the war, Ulrika Eleonora gained a reputation for loyalty to her future home country by exhibiting kindness to Swedish prisoners. She pawned her jewelry, even her engagement ring, to care for Swedish prisoners of war. Her personal merits and continued charitable acts throughout her tenure endeared her to the Swedish people and eased some of the difficulties brought on by her Danish background. In the peace negotiations between Sweden and Denmark in 1679, the marriage between her and Charles XI was on the agenda and ratified on September 26, 1679. They married at Skottorp in May. Charles prioritized government work over private matters, even a marriage ceremony. And is best remembered for a great charitable activity. She was also limited by ill health and numerous pregnancies. Charles was very active and busy, and while Charles was away inspecting his troops or pursuing his pastimes, she was often lonely and sad. The marriage itself, however, is considered a success, with the king and queen being very fond of each other. As queen, Ulrika Eleonora had little political involvement and was placed in the shadow of her mother-in-law. During the Great Reversion to the crown of counties, baronies, and large lordships from the nobility, Ulrika tried to speak out on behalf of the people whose property was confiscated by the crown. But the king told her that the reason he had married her was not because he wanted her political advice. Instead, she helped people whose property had been confiscated by secretly compensating them economically from her own budget. However, Charles XI's confidence in her grew over time. In 1690, he named her future regent should his son succeed him, still a minor. Instead, Ulrika Eleonora predeceased him by almost 4 years. At the time of her death, she was personally supporting 17,000 people. It is said that on his deathbed, Charles XI admitted to his mother that he hadn't been happy since Ulrika Eleonora's death. The marriage produced 7 children, of whom only 3 outlived Charles. Hedwig Sophia, 1681 to 1708, Duchess of Holstein-Gottorp and grandmother of Tsar Peter III. Charles XII, 1682 to 1718, who succeeded him to the throne. He had no issue. Gustav, 1683 to 1685. Ulrich, 1684 to 1685 to 1741, who succeeded her brother on the Swedish throne. No issue. Ulrika Eleonora, the elder, was sickly, and the many childbirths eventually broke her. When she became seriously ill in 1693, Charles finally dedicated his time and care to her. Her death in July that year shook him deeply, and he never fully recovered. Her infant son, Ulrich, 1684-1685, had been given Ulriksdal Palace, which was renamed for him, Ulriksdale. Charles XI had complained of stomach pains since 1694. In the summer of 1696, he asked his doctors for an opinion on the pain that had continuously become worse, but they had no viable cure or treatment for it. He continued to perform his duties as usual, but in February 1697, the pains became too severe for him to cope, and he returned to Stockholm, where the doctors discovered he had a large, hard lump in his stomach. At this point, there was little doctors could do except alleviate the king's pain as best they could. Charles XI died on April 5, 1697, in his 41st year. An autopsy showed the king had developed cancer and that had spread through his entire abdominal cavity. Charles XI has sometimes been described in Sweden as the greatest of all the Swedish kings except for Gustav II Adolphus, unduly eclipsed by his father and his son. In the first half of the 20th century, the view of him changed and he was regarded as the Reistad's biography from 2003. The king is again characterized as a strong-willed shaper of Sweden through economic reforms and achievement of financial and military stability and strength. Charles XI was commemorated on the previous 500 kronor bill. His portrait is taken from one of Ehrenstall's paintings, possibly the one displayed on this page. The king is pictured on the bill since the Bank of Sweden was founded in 1668 during Charles' reign. The fortified town of Karlsberg near Bremen, at the site of modern Bremerhaven, was named after Charles XI. The Swedish town of Karlskrona, built during his reign to host the primary navy base in southern Sweden, which it remains to this day, is all after him. Charles Church in Tallinn, Estonia, is dedicated to Charles XI. The recognition of his swords and corpse didn't show the incorruptibility that medieval hagiograph... let me give that one another try. The recognition of his swords and corpse didn't show the incorruptibility that medieval hagiographers believed to be a sign of Christian sainthood. In 1697, the same belief caused Charles' subjects to ask if God had put the illness inside the king to punish the people or Charles. 2 years later, the course of events that highlighted the crisis was of the absolutism itself. Done. Alright, let me save this project real quick. That one, open a new one. How's the stream going? No concurrent viewers, what a shock. Alright, that's fine. Oh, shit, excuse me. The GE. What's not to love? Oh, shit, excuse me. Back today, man. Like this server hop in a minute. This is getting pretty annoying. Shoot. Alright, let's get the next one started. Three, two, one. Ulrika Eleonora, or Ulrika Eleanor, January 23rd, 1688 to November 24th, 1741, known as Ulrika Eleonora the Younger, reigned as Queen of Sweden from December 5th, 1718 until her abdication on February 29th, 1720 in favor of her husband Frederick. Following her husband's accession as King Frederick I, Ulrika Eleonora served as his queen consort until her death in 1741. Ulrika Eleonora was the youngest child of King Charles XI and Ulrika Eleonora of Denmark, and named after her mother. In 1715, she married Frederick of Hesse-Kassel after the death of her brother Charles XII. In 1718, Ulrika Eleonora claimed the throne. Her deceased older sister, Hedwig Sophia, had left a son, Charles Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp, who had the better claim by primogeniture. Ulrika Eleonora asserted that she was the closest surviving relative of the late king, the idea of proximity of blood, and cited the precedent of Queen Christina. She was recognized as a successor by the Riksdag after she had agreed to renounce the powers of absolute monarchy established by her father. She abdicated in 1720, at which time her husband became king. After their mother's death in 1693, Ulrika Eleonora and her siblings were placed in the care of their grandmother, Hedwig Eleonora. However, her grandmother was known to favor her elder sister. During her childhood, Eleonora was somewhat overlooked in favor of this elder, more extroverted and talented sister, Princess Hedwig Sophia. Her elder siblings enjoyed riding and dancing, and reportedly somewhat looked down upon her, as she did not have the courage to participate in their games and was easily brought to tears. She was described as friendly, modest, and dignified, with good posture and beautiful hands, but she was not regarded as either intelligent or attractive. Her grandmother, Hedwig Eleonora, described her as stubborn, but she was known to demonstrate her dislike of others or events by simulating illness. She was a talented musician, and when performing for her sister at court concerts, she would play the clavier while her sister sang. Ulrika Eleonora lived most of her life in the shadow of others, outshone by her brother the king and by her attractive sister. From 1700, she took care of her dominating grandmother, Hedwig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp, during her brother's absence in the Great Northern War. Her older sister, Hedwig Sophia, was then the heir presumptive to the throne. As their brother, Charles XII, was unmarried and childless, Ulrika Eleonora was regarded as a likely future heir to the throne and was thereby attractive on the marriage market. In 1698, a marriage alliance was suggested by marrying her to Prince Charles of Denmark and her brother to Princess Sophia Hedwig of Denmark. But in 1700, this plan was discarded. In 1700, there were negotiations of a marriage to Frederick William I of Prussia, but nothing came of them. These plans were about to be put into effect when they were disrupted, without motivation, by her brother. She was later made the God-fearing mother of Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, who was named Ulrika after her. In 1702, a marriage to the future King George II of Britain was suggested, but was postponed, and in the end, nothing came of it. Duke John William of Saxe-Gotha was given permission by her brother to court her, but the marriage plans were interrupted after he engaged in a duel with Anders Lagerkrona in the presence of the monarch. In 1710, she received a proposal from Prince Frederick of Hesse. The negotiations were handled by her favorite and confidant, Emerentia von Duben. The marriage was supported by her grandmother, Hedwig Eleonora, as the Queen Dowager thought this would force Ulrika Eleonora to leave Sweden for Hesse, increasing the chances for the son of Ulrika Eleonora's elder sister, Hedwig Sophia of Holstein-Gottorp, to become heir to the throne. The engagement was announced on January 23, 1714, and the wedding took place on March 24, 1715. During the wedding, her brother Charles XII remarked, "Tonight my sister is dancing away the crown." After her grandmother's death in 1715, she became the center of the court, and thus was one of the happiest periods of her life. In 1715, she married Landgrave Frederick I of Hesse Castle. The marriage, which on her side was a love match, became another attempt to use her as a political puppet. Frederick had married her with the intent of reaching the throne, and immediately began plotting to have her named heir in place of her nephew. The Hesse party and the Holstein party stood against each other in the struggle for the throne. Ulrika Eleonora's situation began to change after the death of her older sister, Hedwig Sophia, in 1708. Ulrika Eleonora became the only adult member of the royal house present in Sweden aside from her grandmother, Queen Dowager I Hedwig Eleonora. Already in late 1712, Charles XII had thoughts of making her regent during his absence. The royal court convinced her to be present at their meetings and gave them her support. On November 2nd, 1713, she appeared at her first session, and a decision was made to assemble the Riksdag and to declare her regent in her capacity as the closest heir to the throne. In 1713, the government and her grandmother named her regent during the king's absence, and thus she became a pawn of the many powers struggling for influence in a country without an official heir presumptive or heir apparent. The choice now stood between Ulrika Eleonora and her nephew. Her accession as regent and president of the parliament was treated with great enthusiasm. The Riksdag had opposed her brother as they wanted to abolish the absolute monarchy and reinstate their own power. As the regent, she kept herself informed of state affairs and urged her brother to return, warning him of the effects if he did not. With his permission, she signed all documents of state affairs except those written to him personally. However, she regarded herself only as her brother's representative, and therefore made no suggestions of her own. As his sister many times during the war, she had asked her brother if she could visit him, but was never permitted to. She met her brother for the first time after 16 years in Vadstena in 1716, and after that one last time in Christenham in 1718. On December 5th, 1718, Ulrika Eleonora received the news of the death of her brother, Charles XII. It has never been claimed that she had any advanced knowledge of the purported involvement of her husband's aide, André Sicre, but she did immediately declare herself monarch in Udavala by saying that she had inherited the throne. The council was taken by surprise and did not contest this. She took control of the affairs of state and had George Heinrich von Gortz and his followers removed from power. The Hesse party secured Ulrika Eleanor's succession to the throne. They gained the support of the Riksdag opposition, who wanted to end the absolute monarchy, established in 1680, and reinstate parliamentary rule. On December 15, 1718, she declared that though she had inherited the throne, she did not intend to keep the Carolinian absolutism, but agreed to reinstate the older system. The War Council was determined to abolish absolutism and the right to inherit the throne, but was willing to acknowledge her as an elected monarch. Their opinion was supported by the majority of the Assembly of the Estates. Ulrika Eleanor was forced into agreeing to abolish absolute monarchy and the right to inherit the throne, both for her and her contestant, her nephew Charles Frederick, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. After having agreed to sign the new constitution as monarch, she was elected queen on January 23, 1719. On February 19th, she signed the Instrument of Government, 1719, thereby securing the support of the estates not to give the throne to her nephew and competitor. She was crowned in Uppsala Cathedral on March 17, 1719, and made her formal entrance into Stockholm as monarch on April 11th that same year. During the ceremonies in Stockholm, she received the estates, who passed the throne in possession. On this occasion, she demonstrated that she knew who her followers were. When she received the nobility, she only allowed their representatives to kiss her hand with her glove on, while the other representatives were allowed to kiss her hand without the glove. Ulrika Eleonora never made the traditional journey through the country, the Eriksgata, on her own. Instead, she made it with Frederick in 1722, after his coronation. Her reign occurred just before the end of the Great Northern War, during the Russian pillage of 1719 to 1721. In August of the summer of 1719, the Russian fleet attacked the capital of Stockholm. Despite the ongoing attack, Ulrika Eleanor forced her courtiers to attend a previously accepted reception at the British ambassador's, being so untouched as if there had been no enemies present for hundreds of miles, which was considered to be an impressive act of courage. Her favorite courtier was Emerentia von Duben, 1669 to 1743. Her old nurse, who had been ennobled and made lady-in-waiting in 1707, and with whom she had a close relationship all her life. Dubin acted as her advisor, her comfort, and her support, and was said to not have abused her influence. They were described as sisters. During her short reign, to secure support for her rule, she ennobled many families. In a period of 15 months, she ennobled 181 people, more than any other monarch in Swedish history. 1 count, 2 barons, and 8 lesser noblemen every month. She had 7 field marshals, where her brother only ever had between 3 and 5. Ulrika Eleanor was in fact in favor of an absolute monarchy. She had agreed to the new constitution only to steer the throne from her nephew, and her relations with the council were not good. She came into conflict with the president of the Privy Council, Arvid Horn, who resigned in protest, as well as with his successor, Gustav Kronheim. Horn criticized her for discussing state affairs with her husband, pressed her as to whether she would respect the Constitution, and insulted her by making the remark that nothing better was to be expected under the regiment of a female. These conflicts had deleterious effect on the war and state affairs. Ulrika Eleonora supported the political ambitions of her consort, and from the beginning she wished for him to become her co-monarch in the fashion of William III and Mary II. However, this was not permitted by the Riksdag, one reason being that co-reigning had been forbidden in Sweden since the 15th century. There was also opposition in the Riksdag to the influence of Emerentia von Deuben and her siblings over the affairs of state. Her difficulty in respecting the constitution and trouble in getting along with the Riksdag, as well as her way of continuously disclosing state affairs of her husband, did however make the Riksdag willing to replace her with Frederick as sole monarch if she abdicated, an idea that had the support of Frederick. On February 29, 1720, after having again been denied a co-monarchy, Ulrika Eleonora abdicated in favor of her husband on the condition that she should succeed him if he should die before her. The condition of her abdication, in fact, granted her a place as heir to the Swedish court until her death. The succession was confirmed by the Riksdag. She often spoke of the abdication as the greatest sacrifice of her life. Frederick succeeded her on March 24th, 1720. The reign of her husband began the period traditionally known as the Age of Liberty, when the monarchy lost most of its power to a parliamentary system. As queen consort, she withdrew to private life. Ulrika Eleonora had married for love and was known to be fiercely loyal to Frederick. Initially, the relationship between Ulrika Eleonora and Frederick was described as a happy one, and before Frederick became monarch, he restricted himself to the role of her consort. After two miscarriages in 1715 and 1718, and at least until 1724, the queen expressed hope that she would give birth to an heir, but ultimately her marriage was childless. King Frederick suggested placing his brother and his line in the House of Hesse in the succession line, and though this attempt was unsuccessful, Ulrika Eleonora supported this choice rather than her nephew, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. Queen Ulrika Eleonora enjoyed great popularity during the reign of her spouse, partly as the last member of the old royal house, and partly because of her personal piety. She was aware that this gave her power to influence policy, and when she let her opinion be known, it was often followed. This influence was recognized. During the Riksdag of 1738, for example, the Queen expressed her displeasure when Carl Gustaf Tessin was due to be elected to a post, which resulted in public protests, which did not quiet down until Tessin had been received at the royal palace and allowed to kiss the bare hand of the Queen, who assured him that she had no intention of interfering. The relationship between Ulrika Eleonora and Frederick changed after he became king, and it was said that when she gave him the crown, she gave him his freedom. King Frederick had mistresses, and his extramarital affairs increased after he lost much of his royal authority in 1723. In 1734, Frederick became the first king in Swedish history to have an official mistress, the noblewoman Hedvig Taube, who was given the title Countess of Hessenstein. Ulrika Eleonora expressed her disapproval to her close confidant, Emerentia von Deuben, who convinced her never to display any public reaction to the affair, as it would be beneath the queen's dignity and her position was untouchable. As the moon traveled along its course over the sky without bothering over the barks of dogs, so should her majesty despise the gossip, which has been unleashed by this most unfortunate and blinded commitment. By convincing Ulrika Eleonora not to publicly display her displeasure of his adultery, Emerentia von Deuben also became favored by King Frederick. Ulrika Eleonora sternly followed the policy of not displaying her feelings about the adultery for years. At the beginning of the affair, on one occasion, she even walked publicly with Hedvig Taub in her effort to defend the reputation of her husband. During the Riksdag of 1738, the question of the king's adultery was raised by the clergy estate within the Riksdag of the Estates, and a letter of protest was presented to the king on April 3, 1739. The archbishop had already had a private conversation with the queen about the matter, during which the queen had lamented herself over the king's adultery and her disappointment of the Taub family. The clergy estate pointed to the oath made by the king in 1720 when he succeeded the queen on the Swedish throne after she abdicated in his favor, in which he had made the promise to love, honor, and respect my most worthy consort, the all-powerful Princess Ulrika Eleonora, and declared the estates to be free of their oath of allegiance, should I ever break this oath and insurance. In fact, declaring the king deposed if he disrespected the queen. On April 26th, the king expressed a wish to leave for Hesse. He was rumored to plan to settle there permanently with Taub. A rumor circulated of a planned coup d'etat by the queen's followers. The plan was to have the king leave with Taub, leaving the queen as regent of Sweden in his absence. After his departure, the queen's followers would present her with proof that the king had secretly married Taub, expecting the queen to respond by considering her marriage dissolved and agree to be reinstated as monarch. The planned coup never took place. The king never presented a request to leave for Hesse. During the Riksdag of 1740-1741, the question was raised again. At this point, a change had occurred in the queen's attitude, signs of which were observed already during the Riksdag of 1738. The policy of Ulrika Eleonora not to express her dislike of Frederick's adultery was weakened during her last years, possibly due to the unique position of the Taub as the official mistress, because of the long-term nature of the affair, and because they had children. Another reason for her change of conduct was reportedly that she, as an Orthodox Lutheran, was concerned for the king's soul. Despite demonstrating her compassion for the other Riksdag disposed during the Riksdag of 1738, she smiled when the misfortune of the father of Hedvig Taub was mentioned. When hosting the wedding of her maid of honor, Sigrid Bond, at court, she neglected to invite the Taub, Gilleborg, or Spar families, last two known supporters of Hedvig Taub. Although court protocol would have expected them to be included, and when the new Riksrad Karl Spar, a known supporter of Taub, was presented to her during the audience for the new members of government, she demonstratively retired, preventing him from kissing her skirt in accordance with protocol. The discontent of Queen Ulrika Eleonora was not a small matter for the Riksdag, not only because of the queen's popularity, but also because the queen had abdicated in favor of the king on the condition that she would succeed him if he should die before her, a condition which made the queen heir to the throne. During the Riksdag of 1741, the matter of the king's adultery was, for the second time, raised in Parliament by the clergy estate, this time by Bishop Erik Benzelius, who referred to the matter as that which the queen has made it known that they should raise in order to set the mourning heart of the queen to rest. The official statement of protest was made, stating a reminder of the king's oath always to treat the queen with respect when she abdicated in his favor, and the whole kingdom was in mourning of the queen's sorrow, and concerned with the welfare of the king's soul. Two delegations from the clergy estate were appointed, one to the king, one to Hedvig Taub. In July 1741, the statement was read to the king in his audience chamber. The king reacted with rage, refused to accept the statement, and stated that the Riksdag of the Estates had promised him not to interfere in his private life. He was, on their second attempt, forced to receive the statement. When told the result of the audience with the king, the queen, Ulrika Eleonora, insisted that the planned embassy to Hedvig Taub was also to be executed according to plan, and replied to the hesitation of the bishop with the words, "When you priests follow your calling and your conscience, you do well to do so with no concern of other matters." On this occasion, Hedvig Taub defended her by saying that she had never been aware of any negative reaction whatsoever from the Queen. Ulrika Eleonora served as regent twice, the first time during Frederick's absence in 1731, and the second time during his illness in 1738 to 1739. She was declared regent in May 1731 when Frederick departed to visit Hesse, and ruled until his return in the autumn. In 1738, she was asked by the estates to accept the regency at an occasion when Frederick was so ill that he was in danger of dying and was incapable of ruling. She duly accepted this task and handled state affairs until after New Year's Eve 1738-1739. During her second regency, she banned the newly founded Swedish theater by refusing to extend their access to Borusset. Her reason for this was opposition towards the theater among the clergy. The theater, however, was restored the following year. Ulrika Eleonora was interested in jewelry and music. She enjoyed to participate in the dance at court balls, and through religious scruples made her conflicted in the issue. And though religious scruples made her conflicted at the issue, she also engaged German and French theater companies to perform at Borusset. Intensely religious, she was capable of interrupting a parliamentary session to pray. Similarly, at court presentations, she could interrogate the female debutantes about the Bible, rewarding them for correct answers. Sternly maintaining her royal pride, she was known to simulate illness and decline to leave her quarters when she felt insulted. Her dependency upon Emerentia von Duben had often been mentioned, but she had several additional friends, among them Hedvig Morner, as well as her childhood friend Anna Fleming, who was her lady-in-waiting for 30 years. Queen Ulrika Eleonora died of smallpox in 1741. There are rumors that she had been poisoned, but these rumors were silenced when the marks of her illness were visible during her public lit de parade. She had been the heir to the throne. Her death marked the beginning of a succession crisis. And ugh, beg pardon. I should be able to do U short pose next level. Hopefully the rest of these, maple logs get me to, U long bows, but I'm not counting on it. This riveting content, fletching lombos, isn't that fun? Isn't that fun? Love seeing all these people with their pets hanging around. Kitty. Boop. Boo-doo. Boop, boop. Oh. Boo-doo. Shoot. Ugh. Three, two, one. The House of Palatinate Zweibrücken, a branch of the Wisselbach dynasty, was a ruling dynasty of Sweden from 1654 to 1720. By this point, it had splintered into several different houses. The royal house of Sweden was represented by the branch Palatinate Zweibrücken Kleeberg. The ancestor of the House of Palatinate Zweibrücken was Stefan, Count Palatine of Simmern Zweibrücken, 1385 to 1459, a son of King Rupert of Germany. Some cadet branches are House of Palatinate Kleeberg, House of Palatinate Veldens, House of Palatinate Neuburg, House of Palatinate Sulzbach, House of Palatinate Birkenfield, and House of Carlson, deemed illegitimate. And done. Excuse me. Oh, Jesus. Oh, man. Yeah, I know I should get that in view sooner rather than later. Just too lazy to do last man standing. I don't feel like buying it. Oh, going for the seat. It's good, but I think it's time to take the load off. Oh, all right. Back at it. Oh, pardon. Oh, Actually, I should use the restroom real quick. That'll be you short bows, I think. In this inventory, which is nice. I'm not going to do anything with that. I have a few logs, but I'd rather save them for when I can do longbows. But if I run out of maples, you know what? No, yeah, because I'm gonna have to string them. I should totally manage to get up to you longbows. There it is. Love that. $800 guys, okay. Alright, Audacity, time for another one. 3, 2, 1. In European Christianity, the divine right of kings, divine right, or God's mandation, is a political and religious doctrine of political legitimacy of a monarchy. It is also known as the divine right theory of kingship. The doctrine asserts that a monarch is not accountable to any earthly authority, such as a parliament or pope, because their right to rule is derived from divine authority. Thus, the monarch is not subject to the will of the people, of the aristocracy, or of any other estate of the realm. It follows that only divine authority can judge a monarch, and that any attempt to depose, dethrone, resist, or restrict their powers runs contrary to God's will and may constitute a sacrilegious act. It does not imply that their power is absolute. In its full-fledged form, the divine right of kings is associated with Henry VIII of England and the Acts of Supremacy, James VI and I of Scotland and England, Louis XIV of France, and their successors. In contrast, the conception of human rights started being developed during the Middle Ages by scholars such as St. Thomas Aquinas, and were systematized by the thinkers of the Age of Enlightenment, for example, John Locke. Liberty, dignity, freedom, and equality are examples of important human rights. Divine right has been a key element of the self-legitimization of many absolute monarchies, connected with their authority and the right to rule. Related but distinct notions include cacipropism, the complete subordination of bishops etc., to the secular power, supremacy, the legal supremacy of the civil laws over the laws of the church, absolutism, a form of monarchical and despotic power that is unrestrained by all other institutions such as churches, legislatures, or social elites, or tyranny, an absolute ruler who is unrestrained even by moral law. Historically, many notions of rights have been authoritarian and hierarchical, with different people granted different rights and some having more rights than others. For instance, the right of a father to receive respect from his son did not indicate a right for the son to receive a return from that respect. Analogously, the divine right of kings, which permitted absolute power over subjects, provided few rights for the subjects themselves. It is sometimes signified by the phrase, by the grace of God, or its Latin equivalent, Dei gratia, which has historically been attached to the titles of certain reigning monarchs. Note, however, that such accountability only to God does not per se make the monarch a sacred king. Paverna is an Iranian and Zoroastrian concept, which literally means glory, about divine right of the kings. This may stem from early Mesopotamian culture, where kings were often regarded as deities after their death. Shulgi of Ur was among the first Mesopotamian rulers to declare himself to be divine. In the Iranian view, kings would never rule unless Kavrena was with them, and they will never fall unless Kavrena leaves them. For example, according to the Karnamag of Ardashir, when Ardashir I of Persia and Artabanus V of Parthia fought for the throne of Iran, on the road, Artanibus and his contingent are overtaken by an enormous ram, which is also following Ardashir. Artabanus' religious advisor explained to him that the ram is a manifestation of the Quara of the ancient Iranian kings, which is leaving Artabanus to join Ardashir. The imperial cult of ancient Rome identified Roman emperors and some members of their families with the divinely sanctioned authority, auctoritas, of the Roman state. The official ruler of cultus to a living emperor acknowledged his office and rule as divinely approved and constitutional. His principate should therefore demonstrate pious respect for traditional republican deities and mores. Many of the rights, practices, and status distinctions that characterized the cult to emperors were perpetuated in the theology and politics of the Christianized empire. While the earliest references to kingship in Israel proclaim that, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Deuteronomy 17:14-15. Significant debate on the legitimacy of kingship has persisted in rabbinical Judaism until Maimonides, though many mainstream currents continue to reject the notion. The controversy is highlighted by the instructions to the Israelites in the above quoted passage, as well as the passages in 1 Samuel 8 and 12 concerning the dispute over kingship and Parshat Shofim. It is from 1 Samuel 8 that the Jews receive Misfat ha-Melech, the ius regium, or the law of kingship, and from this passage the Maimonides finally concludes that Judaism supports the institution of monarchy, saying that Israelites have been given 3 commandments upon entering the land of Israel: to designate a king for themselves, to wipe out the memory of Amalek, and to build the temple. The debate has primarily centered around the problem of being told to designate a king, which some rabbinical sources have argued is an invocation against a divine right of kings and a call to elect a leader in opposition to a notion of a divine right. Other rabbinical arguments have put forward an idea that it is through the collective decision of the people that God's will is made manifest, and that the king does therefore have a divine right once appointed by the nation. He is God's emissary. Jewish law requires one to recite a special blessing upon seeing a monarch. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given from his glory to flesh and blood. Well, excuse me there. With the rise of firearms, nation-states in the Protestant Reformation in the late 16th century, the theory of divine right justified the king's absolute authority in both political and spiritual matters. Henry VIII of England declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England and exerted the power of the throne more than any of his predecessors. As a political theory, it was further developed by James VI of Scotland, 1567 to 1625, and came to the fore in England under his reign as James I of England, 1603 to 1625. Louis XIV of France, 1643 to 1715, strongly promoted the theory as well. Historian J.P. Somerville stresses the theory was polemic. Absolutists magnified royal power. They did this to protect the state against anarchy and to refute the ideas of resistance theorists, those being in Britain Catholic and Presbyterian theorists. The concept of divine right incorporates but exaggerates the ancient Christian concept of royal God-given rights, which teach that the right to rule is anointed by God, although this idea is found in many other cultures, including Aryan and Egyptian traditions. In pagan religions, the king was often seen as God incarnate, and so was an unchallengeable despot. The ancient Roman Catholic tradition overcame this idea with the doctrine of 2 swords, and so achieved for the very first time a balanced constitution for states. The advent of Protestantism saw something of a return to the idea of a more unchallengeable despot. The Christian notion of a divine right of kings is traced to a story found in 1 Samuel, where the prophet Samuel anoints Saul and then David as Messiah, anointed one, king over Israel. In the Jewish traditions, the lack of a divine leadership represented by an anointed king beginning shortly after the death of Joshua left the people of Israel vulnerable, and the promise of the promised land was not fully fulfilled until a king was anointed by a prophet on behalf of God. The effect of anointing was seen to be that the monarch became inviolable, so that even when Saul sought to kill David, David would not raise his hand against him because he was the Lord's anointed. Raising a hand to a king was therefore considered to be as sacrilegious as raising a hand against God. and stood on equal footing as blasphemy. In essence, the king stood in place of God and was never to be challenged without the challenger being accused of blasphemy, except by a prophet, which under Christianity was replaced by the church. Outside of Christianity, kings were often seen as ruling with the backing of heavenly powers. Although the later Roman Empire had developed the European concept of a divine regent in late antiquity, Adomnan of Ionia provides one of the earliest written examples of a Western medieval concept of kings ruling with divine right. He wrote of the Irish king Diarmaid mac Cerbaile's assassination and claimed that divine punishment fell on his assassin for the act of violating the monarch. Adomnan was also recorded a story about Saint Columba supposedly being visited by an angel carrying a glass book, who told him to ordain Aidan mac Gabrain as king of Dal Riata. Columba initially refused, and the angel answered by whipping him and demanding that he perform the ordination because God had commanded it. The same angel visited Columba on 3 successive nights. Columba finally agreed, and Aidan came to receive ordination. At the ordination, Columba told Aidan that so long as he obeyed God's laws, then none of his enemies would prevail against him. But the moment he broke them, this protection would end, and the same whip with which Columba had been struck would be turned against the king. Adomnan's writings most likely influenced other Irish writers, who in turn influenced continental ideas as well. Pepin the Short's coronation may have also come from the same influence. The Byzantine Empire can be seen as the progenitor of this concept, which began with Constantine I. This in turn inspired the Carolingian dynasty and the Holy Roman Emperors, whose lasting impact on Western and Central Europe further inspired all subsequent Western ideas of kingship. In the Middle Ages, the idea that God had granted certain earthly powers to the monarch just as he had given spiritual authority and power to the church, especially to the Pope, was already a well-known concept long before later writers coined the term divine right of kings and employed it as a theory in political science. However, the dividing line for the authority and power was a subject of frequent contention, notably in England with the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170. For example, Richard I of England declared at his trial during the Diet of Speyer in 1193, "I am born in a rank which recognizes no superior but God, to whom alone I am responsible for my actions." It is Richard who first used the motto, "Dio et mon droit," God and my right, which is still the motto of the monarch of the United Kingdom. Thomas Aquinas condoned extra-legal tyrannicide in the worst of circumstances. When there is no recourse to a superior by whom judgment can be made about an invader, then he who slays a tyrant to liberate his fatherland is to be praised and receives a reward. On the other hand, Aquinas forbade the overthrow of any morally, Christianly, and spiritually legitimate king by his subjects. The only human power capable of deposing the king was the Pope. The reasoning was that if a subject may overthrow his superior for some bad law, who is to be judge of whether the law was bad? If the subject could so judge his own superior, then all lawful superior authority could lawfully be overthrown by the arbitrary judgment of an inferior, and thus all law was under constant threat. According to John of Paris, kings had their jurisdictions and bishops and the Pope had theirs, but kings had derived their supreme, non-absolute temporal jurisdiction from popular consent. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, many philosophers, such as Nicholas of Cusa and Francisco Suarez, proposed similar theories. The Church was the final guarantor of Christian kings who would follow laws and constitutional traditions of their ancestors and the laws of God and of justice. Radical English theologian John Wycliffe's theory of dominium meant that injuries inflicted on someone personally by a king should be borne by them submissively, a conventional idea, but that injuries by a king against God should be patently resisted, even to death. Gravely sinful kings and popes forfeited their divine right to obedience and ownership, though the political order should be maintained. More aggressive versions of this were taken up by Lollards and Hussites. That is patiently. Oh, oops. For Erasmus of Rotterdam, it was the consent of the people which gives and takes away the purple, not an unchangeable divine mandate. Roman Catholic jurisprudence, the monarch is always subject to natural and divine law, which are regarded as superior to the monarch. The possibility of monarchy declining morally, overturning natural law, and degenerating into tyranny oppressive of the general welfare was answered theologically with the Catholic concept of the spiritual superiority of the Pope. There is no Catholic concept of extra-legal tyrannicide, as some falsely suppose, the same being expressly condemned by St. Thomas Aquinas in Chapter 7 of his De Regno. Catholic thought justified limited submission to the monarchy by reference to the following. The Old Testament, in which God chose kings to rule over Israel, beginning with Saul, who was then rejected by God in favor of David, whose dynasty continued at least in the southern kingdom until the Babylonian captivity. The New Testament, in which the first Pope Peter commands that all Christians shall honor the Roman emperor, even though at that time he was still a pagan emperor. Paul agreed with Peter that subjects should be obedient to the powers that be because they are appointed by God, as he wrote in his epistle to the Romans. Likewise, Jesus Christ proclaims in the Gospel of Matthew that one should render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. That is, at first, literally the payment of taxes as binding those who use the imperial currency. Jesus told Pontius Pilate that his authority as Roman governor of Judea came from heaven, according to John 19, 10-11. The endorsement by the popes and the church of the line of emperors beginning with the emperors Constantine and Theodosius, later the Eastern Roman empires, and finally the Western Roman Empire, Charlemagne and his successors, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperors. The divine right of kings, or divine right theory of kingship, is a political-religious doctrine of royal and political legitimacy. It asserts that a monarch is subject to no earthly authority, deriving his right to rule directly from the will of God. The king is thus not subject to the will of his people, the aristocracy, or any other estate of the realm, including, in the view of some, especially in Protestant countries, the church. A weaker or more moderate form of this political theory does hold, however, that the king is subject to the church and the pope, although completely irreproachable in other ways, but according to this doctrine in its strong form, only God can judge an unjust king. The doctrine implies that any attempt to depose the king or to restrict his powers runs contrary to the will of God, and may constitute a sacrilegious act. The Scots textbook of the Divine Right of Kings were written in 1597 to 1598 by James VI of Scotland. His Basilicon Doron, a manual on the powers of a king, was written to edify his 4-year-old son, Henry Frederick, that a king acknowledgeth himself ordained for his people, having received from God a burden of government, whereof he must be countable. The conception of ordination brought with it largely unspoken parallels with the Anglican and Catholic priesthood, but the overriding metaphor in James VI's Basilicon Doron was that of a father's relation to his children. Just as no misconduct on the part of the father can free his children from obedience to the fifth commandment. James, after becoming James I of England, also had printed his Defense of the Right of Kings in the face of English theories of inalienable popular and clerical rights. He based his theories in part on his understanding of the Bible, as noted by the following quote from a speech to Parliament delivered in 1610 as James I of England. The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. There be 3 principal comparisons that illustrate the state of monarchy. 1, taken out of the Word of God, and the 2 other out of the grounds of policy and philosophy. In the scriptures, kings are called gods, and so their power after a certain relation compared to the divine power. Kings are also compared to fathers of families, for a king is true parens patriae, parent of the country, the politic father of his people. And lastly, kings are compared to the head of this microcosm of the body of man. James' reference to God's lieutenants is apparently a reference to the text in Romans 13, where Paul refers to God's ministers. 1. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, or avenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Some of the symbolism within the coronation ceremony for British monarchs, in which they are anointed with holy oils by the Archbishop of Canterbury, thereby ordaining them to monarchy, perpetuates the ancient Roman Catholic monarchical ideas and ceremonial. Although few Protestants realize this, the ceremony is nearly entirely based upon that of the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor. However, in the UK, the symbolism ends there, since the real governing authority of the monarch was all but extinguished by the Whig Revolution of 1688 to 89. The king or queen of the United Kingdom is one of the last monarchs still to be crowned in the traditional Christian ceremonial, which in most other countries has been replaced by an inauguration or other declaration. In England, it is not without significance that the sacerdotal vestments, generally discarded by the clergy, dalmatic, alb, and stole, continued to be among the insignia of the sovereign. Moreover, the sacrosanct character he acquired not by virtue of his sacring, but by hereditary right. The coronation, anointing, and vesting were but the outward and visible symbol of a divine grace adherent in the sovereign by the virtue of his title. Even Roman Catholic monarchs like Louis XIV would never have admitted that their coronation by the archbishop constituted any part to their title to reign. It was no more than the consecration of their title. The French prelate Jacques Spening-Bosset made a classic statement of the doctrine of divine right in a sermon preached before King Louis XIV. Kings reign by me, says eternal wisdom, per me regis regnam. And from that we must conclude not only that the rights of royalty are established by its laws, but also that the choice of persons to occupy the throne is an effect of its providence. The French Huguenot nobles and clergy, having rejected the Pope and the Catholic Church, were left only with the supreme power of the king, who, they taught, could not be gainsaid or judged by anyone, since there was no longer the countervailing power of the papacy, and since the Church of England was a creature of the state and had become subservient to it, this meant that there was nothing to regulate the powers of the king, and he became an absolute power. In theory, divine, natural, customary, and constitutional law still held sway over the king, but absent a superior spiritual power, it was difficult to see how they could be enforced, since the king could not be tried by any of his own courts. One passage in Scripture supporting the idea of the divided right of kings was used by Martin Luther when urging the secular authorities to crush the peasant rebellion of 1525 in Germany and his Against the Murderous, Feeding Hordes of Peasants, basing his argument on Paul's epistle to the Romans. It is related to the ancient Catholic philosophies regarding monarchy, in which the monarch is God's vice-regent upon the earth and therefore subject to no inferior power. Before the Reformation, the anointed king was, within his realm, the accredited vicar for God for secular purposes. After the Reformation, he or she, if queen regnant, became this in Protestant states for religious purposes also. Excuse me. In the 16th century, both Catholic and Protestant political thinkers alike challenged the idea of a monarch's divine right. The Spanish Catholic historian Juan de Mariana put forward the argument in his book De Rege et Regis Institutione, 1598, that since society was formed by a pact among all its members, there can be no doubt that they are able to call a king to account. Mariana thus challenged divine right theories by stating in certain circumstances tyrannicide could be justified. Cardinal Robert Berlaymne also did not believe that the Institute of Monarchy had any divine sanction and shared Mariana's belief that there were times where Catholics could lawfully remove a monarch. Among groups of English Protestant exiles fleeing from Queen Mary I, some of the earliest anti-monarchist publications emerged, weaned off uncritical royalism by the actions of Queen Mary, the political thinking of men like Ponet, Knox, Goodman, and Hales. In 1553, Mary I, a Roman Catholic, succeeded her Protestant half-brother, Edward VI, to the English throne. Mary set about trying to restore Roman Catholicism by making sure that Edward's religious laws were abolished in the Statute of Repeal Act, 1553. The Protestant religious laws passed at the time of Henry VIII were repealed, and the revival of the Heresy Acts were passed in late 1554. When Thomas Wyatt the Younger instigated what became known as Wyatt's Rebellion in early 1554, Jean Bonnet, the highest-ranking ecclesiastic among the exiles, allegedly participated in the uprising. He escaped to Strasbourg after the rebellion's defeat, and the following year he published a short treatise on politic power, in which he put forward a theory of justified opposition to secular rulers. Bonnet's treatise comes first in a new wave of anti-monarchical writings. It has never been assessed at its true importance for its antidotes by several years, those more brilliantly expressed but less radical Huguenot writings which have usually been taken to represent tyrannicide theories of the Reformation. A.G. Dickens. Bonnet's pamphlet was republished on the eve of King Charles I's execution. According to U.S. President John Adams, Bonnet's work contained all the essential principles of liberty, which are afterwards dictated by Sidney and Locke, including the idea of a three-branched government. Over time, opposition to the divine right of kings came from a number of sources, including poet John Milton in his pamphlet The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, and Thomas Paine in his pamphlet Common Sense. By 1700, Anglican Archbishop was prepared to assert that kings hold their crowns by law alone, and the law may forfeit them. Probably the two most famous declarations of a right to revolution against tyranny in the English language are John Locke's essay concerning the true, original extent and end of civil government and Thomas Jefferson's formulation in the United States Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. In England, the doctrine of the divine right of kings was developed to its most extreme logical conclusions during the political controversies of the 17th century. Its most famous exponent was Sir Robert Filmer. It was the main issue to be decided by the English Civil War, the Royalists holding that all Christian kings, princes, and governors derive their authority direct from God, and the parliamentarians that this authority is the outcome of a contract, actual or implied, between sovereign and people. In England, the doctrine... oops. I just did that one. Okay. In one case, the king's power would be unlimited, according to the famous saying misattributed to Louis XIV, L'État c'est moi, or limited only by his own free act. In the other, his actions would be governed by the advice and consent of the people, to whom he would ultimately be responsible. The victory of this latter principle was proclaimed to all the world by the execution of Charles I. The doctrine of divine right indeed for a while drew nourishment from the blood of the royal martyr. It was the guiding principle of the Anglican Church of the Restoration, but it suffered a rude blow when James II of England made it impossible for the clergy to obey both their conscience and their king. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 made an end of it as a great political force. This has led to the constitutional development of the crown in Britain, as held by descent modified and modifiable by parliamentary action. Related concepts in other religions include the mandate of heaven and Mark as the son of heaven in the Sinosphere, Madkhalism, Islam, monarchs who are also deities, god emperors, god kings, sacred kings, the occupant of the monarchy gains religious significance or has support from the deity, and Cakravartin in South Asia. Three, two, one, done. Great, another one down. about that anymore. It's okay.